Crystal chandeliers spill gold across the Whitmore ballroom. A string quartet weaves through the perfume of orchids and champagne. 300 of New York's oldest fortunes hold their breath as billionaire Charles Whitmore lifts the microphone and tells his only daughter she must choose her husband tonight before all of them. Heirs in midnight tuxedos straighten their cuffs. Mothers smile like polished knives. Then Amelia Whitmore descends the marble staircase in white silk, her heels echoing like a verdict, and walks past every prince of Manhattan. She stops behind the service door in front of a man with a frayed shirt cuff and grease on his thumb. His name tag reads, Jacob Miller, a single father called in to fix the wiring. I choose him. The room turns to glass. Then Jacob lowers his eyes and refuses her softly before everyone. Why would a poor man turn his back on the one thing the world is dying for? The morning Jacob Miller drove across the Brooklyn Bridge to the Whitmore estate, he had already been awake for 4 hours. Sophie had crawled into his bed before dawn, the way she did every time the radiator hissed too loud and her small chest tightened. He had counted her breaths until they evened out the way the pulmonologist had taught him, his thumb tracing the bones at the back of her neck. Then he had made her pancakes shaped like rabbits, because she was 7 years old, and rabbits were the only animals she still believed in. Their apartment in Brooklyn was 2 narrow rooms above a laundromat. The pipes sang at night. The window over the sink looked straight into a brick wall. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a school bus, was a photograph of a woman with copper-colored hair laughing into the camera, with both hands cupped around a coffee mug. Emma. 3 years gone now. The hospital had told her there was no room. The hospital had told her to come back in the morning. By the morning, there had been no Emma. Jacob had not said a word against any rich man's hospital since. He had simply made a promise to himself, soft and unbreakable, that his daughter would never have to beg anyone for anything. Not for medicine, not for kindness, not for love. He kissed the top of Sophie's head, dropped her at his neighbor's apartment, and drove the van into Manhattan, with his toolbox rattling in the back. Across the river, in a stone house that overlooked the East River, the way a museum overlooks its own quiet exhibits. Amelia Whitmore stood at a tall window and watched a gardener trim a hedge into the shape of a swan. She was 26. She wore a robe the color of bone. On the dressing table behind her, a string of pearls older than the city of New York lay coiled on a velvet tray waiting for her throat. Her mother had left this house when Amelia was 10 years old. She still remembered the morning, the click of suitcases on marble, the cold kiss on her forehead, the way her father had not looked up from his newspaper. After that, there had been Swiss boarding schools where the snow fell quietly on the cypress trees. Summers in Lake Como, 1,000 dinners, where she learned to smile without using her eyes. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to feel less like a daughter and more like a piece in a collection. She had not chosen the dress laid out on the chaise. She had not chosen the guests. She had not chosen the song the quartet would play when she descended the stairs that night. She did not yet know she had not chosen the husband either. 2 floors below her, in the green-walled study where 4 generations of Whitmore men had signed contracts and ended dynasties, Charles Whitmore folded a single envelope in half and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The letter inside was from his cardiologist. The words, "early-stage heart failure," had been printed in a careful apologetic font, as though the doctor who wrote them had been afraid of the man who would read them. Charles was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of dying with the Whitmore name in less able hands than his own. The Ashford merger had been 3 years in the making, a quiet, immense thing involving shipping lanes and Senate friendships, and a son named Sebastian, who had been raised since boyhood to inherit it. The merger required a marriage. The marriage required a daughter. Charles had watched his wife leave him once because he had told her what to do. He would not make that mistake twice. So he had built the choosing a stage, a microphone, 300 witnesses, a slate of suitors he had already vetted in private. Amelia would choose. Amelia would feel free. And Amelia would choose Sebastian Ashford, because Sebastian was the only one left standing when the music stopped. It was an elegant cage. He was proud of it. By the time Jacob's van rolled through the service gates of the Whitmore estate, the caterers were already unloading silver. He carried his toolbox along the back paths, past the rose garden, past the kitchen, where the smell of butter and saffron rose like a wall. The estate manager pointed him to the breaker room and handed him a list backup generator, the chandelier circuit in the ballroom, 2 outlets in the powder rooms, 1 stage light that had been flickering since the rehearsal the night before. Jacob worked the way he always worked, quietly, thoroughly. He did not look up at the ceiling murals or the gold filigree on the cornices. Wealth did not impress him. He had stopped being impressed by wealth on the morning a man in cufflinks had explained to him in soft, regretful sentences why a hospital with empty rooms could not admit his wife. He helped where help was needed and where no one was watching. In a narrow corridor near the kitchen, a young waitress dropped a tray of champagne flutes and froze with her hand over her mouth as the head butler turned toward the sound. Jacob crouched down beside her, gathered the broken glass into his rag, and told the butler in a calm, even voice that he had bumped her with his ladder. The butler walked away. The girl did not say thank you because she could not yet trust her voice. She only touched his sleeve. Later on, a back landing of the upper gallery, he found an older woman in pearls leaning against the wall, with her breathing thin and uneven. He sat her down on a velvet bench, found her a glass of water, and stayed with her until her color came back. Her name was Mrs. Talbot, she said, and her doctor had told her she should not have come tonight. He told her gently that her doctor had probably been right. The side stairs of the Whitmore mansion were the kind of stairs the family pretended did not exist. Narrow, unpolished, lit by a single yellow bulb. Jacob came up them with a coil of copper wire over his shoulder and almost walked into a woman. She had her back against the wall and a cigarette half raised to her lips and her shoes off beside her. She had taken off the pearls he could still see the small imprint of on her collarbone. She wore a simple gray cloak over a slip of something pale. In the bad light, with her hair half pinned and her eyes wet, she looked like any of the dozen tired girls he had passed in service corridors that month. He stepped back to give her room. He set the wire down. He took a clean handkerchief from his back pocket, folded into a neat square, because Sophie had folded it for him that morning, and offered it without looking at her face. "For the smoke," he said quietly, "or for whatever else." She took it. Her fingers were cold. He picked up the wire and started past her. People back here were always doing the same thing. Breathing. At the top of the stairs, he turned around because something made him turn around. And he said in the same low voice, "You don't have to smile if you don't feel like smiling." Then he was gone. Amelia stood in the yellow light with the handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that someone in this house had looked at her and seen a person. An hour later, the chandeliers were lit. The quartet played a Brahms waltz so slow it sounded like a question. 300 of New York's oldest fortunes filled the ballroom in midnight tuxedos and gowns the color of jewels. Charles Whitmore climbed the small dais at the head of the room and tapped the microphone twice. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about the careful weight of names. Then he said very gently that his only daughter would choose her husband tonight in front of all of them because he believed in her judgment. Sebastian Ashford was the first man to step forward. He was tall, blonde, expensive. He had been told 2 weeks earlier exactly how this evening would end. He smiled at Amelia, the way a man smiles at a door he already has the key to. Amelia came down the marble staircase slowly. Her white silk dress moved against the steps like water. The pearls were back at her throat. She passed Sebastian without looking at him. She passed a banking heir. She passed the son of a senator. She passed the grandson of a man who had once owned half of Pennsylvania. The room understood with each step she took that something had gone wrong with the script. She stopped in front of the service door at the far end of the ballroom, where Jacob Miller had just slipped through with his toolbox in one hand, on his way back to his van. He looked up. He saw her face. He understood all at once who she was. "I choose him," Amelia said. The room turned to glass. 300 faces stared. Charles Whitmore went very still on the dais. Sebastian Ashford's smile slipped 1 inch and stopped. Jacob saw 3 things in the same instant: the cold contempt in Charles's eyes, the sharp new hatred in Sebastian's, and Emma's face on the refrigerator in his Brooklyn kitchen. He set the toolbox down at his feet. He lowered his eyes the way he had lowered them in a hospital corridor 3 years before, and he spoke softly enough that only the front rows could hear him. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. I don't belong in this world, and I won't bring my daughter into it." 100 phones lifted at the same moment, like a field of small white flowers turning toward the sun. Sunrise came over Brooklyn the color of old brass. Jacob Miller stood at the window above the laundromat with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand, and he watched the cameras assemble on the sidewalk below. There were 4 news vans by 6 o'clock, 6 by 7. The clip from the night before had not stopped moving since the moment Amelia Whitmore had said 3 words at the bottom of a marble staircase. By 9, the front page of every tabloid in New York carried the same "Still Amelia" in white silk. Jacob in a service shirt, the words "I choose him" stamped in inch-tall letters across his chest. Sophie was at the kitchen table eating cereal in her pajamas. He had not turned the television on. He did not need to. He could hear it from the apartment across the hall, the anchor's smooth, amused voice, the words "gold digger" and "rags to riches" and "electrician." He drove her to school the way he always did. A photographer leaned through the gate of the schoolyard and shouted her name. Sophie's name. That was the moment Jacob understood that the world was now going to come for his daughter too. At lunchtime, Sophie's teacher called him to come pick her up. He found her in the nurse's office with her face pressed into the leather of a chair. She had been told by a boy in her class that her daddy wanted to marry a princess for her money. She did not understand what a gold digger was, but she understood that the other children had stopped speaking to her in the hallway. He carried her out to the van without saying anything. He set her in the passenger seat. He buckled her in. He drove home with his jaw tight enough that he could feel the joint click. Across the river, Amelia Whitmore stood in the green-walled study while her father did not look at her. Charles spoke instead to the window. He told her she would not leave the estate that week. He told her she would have dinner with Sebastian Ashford on Friday, that the Ashfords had agreed to call the entire matter a misunderstanding, and that she would be photographed laughing on Sebastian's arm in front of the Opera House by Saturday night. He told her she would do this because the Whitmore name had survived 2 wars and 4 recessions and could not be undone by 1 foolish minute on a staircase. Amelia listened to the back of her father's head. She did not answer him. She walked upstairs, locked her bedroom door, sat on the edge of her bed in last night's white silk, and stared at the small, black smudge on the hem where it had brushed the floor of the service corridor. Then she pulled on a coat, climbed down the rose trellis outside her window, the way she had not climbed it since she was 15, and took a cab to Brooklyn. The cab let her out across the street from the laundromat. She stood on the curb for a long time. Her shoes were not made for the sidewalk. Her coat was the wrong color for the neighborhood. A man came out of the bodega next door, recognized her face from the morning's paper, and crossed the street without looking back at her. She climbed the narrow staircase to Jacob's apartment alone. He did not open the door. He stood behind it with one hand on the lock and listened to her speak through the wood. Her voice was small and careful. She said she had not meant for any of this to find his daughter. She said she had not slept. She said she did not know what to do with herself, except come here and tell him she was sorry. The silence that came after her voice was longer than any silence he had allowed himself in years. He did not open the door. She slid a folded piece of paper under it. He waited until her footsteps had reached the bottom of the staircase before he bent down and picked it up. "I had no right to choose you in front of all those people. I am sorry. I am only writing this so I can finally say it." He folded the note and put it inside the drawer, where he kept the unopened envelopes from collection agencies. 3 days later, Amelia came back. This time, she brought a white bakery box tied with twine. She did not knock. She set the box down on the welcome mat and walked back down the stairs. Sophie opened the door first. She always opened the door first. The box held 4 chocolate eclairs. There was no note. Sophie looked up at her father with crumbs already on her chin and the careful, considering expression of a girl who had inherited her mother's instinct for sorting people. She said very seriously that the lady from the staircase had good taste in pastries. Jacob did not throw the eclairs away. The week after that, Amelia knocked. He let her in because Sophie had made him promise that he would. She came into the apartment and did not look around. She did not measure the size of it. She did not measure him. She asked if she could help with the dishes. He told her she did not know how. She said she would like to learn. She broke a glass in the first 10 minutes. She apologized for the glass. He told her glasses were not the kind of thing that mattered, and that was the first sentence he had spoken to her without keeping a wall between them. She came back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. Sophie taught her the names of the building's 3 stray cats. Sophie taught her how to fold a paper crane. Sophie taught her in a low, matter-of-fact voice while they sat on the fire escape that Daddy forgot to eat breakfast. When he was sad, that Daddy was a little afraid of thunder, and that Daddy kept a small framed photograph of someone named Emma on the table beside his bed, and turned it face down every morning so he wouldn't cry when he saw her first. Amelia did not write any of this down. She did not have to. She carried it the way one carries a small lit candle through a cold house. One night, when Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch with one of Amelia's hands in her hair, Jacob sat across from Amelia at the kitchen table and told her about Emma. He spoke quietly, the way a man speaks when he is afraid the words will break in his mouth. He told her about the morning at the hospital. He told her about the man in the cufflinks. He told her that he had spent 3 years not saying any of this to anyone. He told her finally, the only thing he had never said out loud, that he was still angry, and that he was afraid the anger was the only piece of Emma he had left. Amelia did not reach across the table. She did not say she understood. She said only, "I'm glad you told me." He looked at her, then for a long moment in the yellow kitchen light. It was the second time in his life he had seen her, truly seen her. The first time, she had been a tired girl on a service staircase. This time, she was a woman who had crossed a river to wash his dishes and learn the names of his cats. The asthma attack came on a Thursday in October, just past 2 in the morning. Jacob was awake before he understood why he was awake. Then he heard it, the dry whistling of his daughter's chest, the sound he had been trained to fear more than any other sound in the world. He carried her down the stairs in a blanket. The cab driver took one look at her face and ran every red light from Brooklyn to the East River. The emergency room he chose was the closest one to her pediatrician's records. He had not realized, until he stood under the white fluorescent sign at the ambulance bay, that it was the same hospital where Emma had been turned away on a winter night 3 years before. Sophie was wheeled in fast. He stood at the admissions desk with shaking hands and a wallet that did not contain what the woman behind the glass was asking for. Pediatric ICU, specialist consultation. A treatment plan that would run the woman explained kindly well into 5 figures before the week was over. He felt the floor move under him. He understood in that moment that he had spent 3 years building a small, careful life, so that this exact moment would never come for his daughter, and the floor had moved anyway. Then Amelia was there. He did not know how she had gotten there. He did not ask. She put her hand flat on the admissions counter and said a sentence quietly enough that only the woman behind the glass could hear it. The woman behind the glass picked up a telephone. Within 10 minutes, Sophie had a private room, a pulmonologist who had been pulled out of bed, and a nurse who would not leave her side until morning. Jacob found Amelia in the hallway near the vending machine. He did not thank her. He was too tired and too afraid to thank her, and underneath both of those things, he was angry in a way he could not yet name. He asked her where the money had come from. He asked her if her father was watching all of this from a desk somewhere. She told him no. She told him she had been writing for 3 years under a pseudonym she had given herself when she was 22. Restaurant pieces, travel essays, a column nobody at the estate read, because nobody at the estate read anything that did not carry her family's name. She told him the money in the account she had drawn from was hers, not her father's. Hers. She told him in the same low, even voice that she had not given the money to him. She had given the money to Sophie. He sat down on the linoleum floor of the hospital hallway with his back against the wall. He did not cry. He did not speak. He let her sit down next to him and put her shoulder against his, and they stayed like that until a nurse came out and told them that Sophie was sleeping. He spent the night in a chair beside his daughter's bed. He wrote down the name of every medication on a napkin from the cafeteria, because writing them down was the only way he had ever known how to be a father in a room he could not control. His hand shook when the pulmonologist came in to talk to him at sunrise. Amelia saw the shaking. Amelia did not look away. Somewhere across the city in the back of a private car, Charles Whitmore listened to a quiet briefing from a man who had been following his daughter for several weeks. The man told him about the hospital. The man told him about the pseudonym. The man told him that Amelia had not gone home in 2 nights. Charles set the report down on the seat beside him and looked out at the lit-up skyline. He understood with a coldness that surprised him that this was no longer rebellion. His daughter was in love with the electrician. Sebastian Ashford did not believe in coincidences, and he did not believe in second chances. He had built his life on the premise that the right phone call made early enough could end any inconvenient situation before it grew teeth. By the following Monday morning, he was making phone calls. He called the hotel manager on Lexington, who used Jacob's company for off-hours maintenance. By Tuesday, Jacob's contract was canceled. He called the property management firm that handled the building on 47th, and the building on 63rd, and the building on 5th, and by Wednesday, Jacob's name had been removed from every approved vendor list in Midtown. He called the landlord who owned the brick walk-up above the laundromat in Brooklyn, bought the building through a shell company by Friday, and tripled the rent in a letter slipped under Jacob's door on Saturday morning. Then he called a lawyer. The letter that arrived at Sophie's school on the following Monday was not signed by anyone Sophie's principal had ever heard of, but it carried the letterhead of a firm whose retainer cost more than the school's entire annual budget. It expressed concern. It mentioned in the careful, neutral language of men who have never raised a child that Sophie Miller's home environment had recently been compromised by erratic adult relationships and ongoing media exposure. It requested a meeting with the school's child welfare liaison. Charles Whitmore knew what Sebastian was doing. The reports from his investigator crossed his desk every other morning. He read them in the green-walled study with a glass of water and a careful expression, and he did not pick up the telephone. He told himself the boy was overstepping. He told himself he would intervene when the time came. He told himself in the back room of his own mind that perhaps a little pressure would be the thing that finally brought his daughter home. He was an intelligent man. He had been wrong about many things in his life. This one was beginning to be the worst. Jacob lost weight. Jacob stopped sleeping. The light went on at 3 in the morning in the apartment above the laundromat and stayed on. He stopped taking the rare phone call that came because 9 times out of 10, the voice on the other end was a reporter or a man asking him quietly when he intended to move out. Amelia walked into the green-walled study on a Wednesday afternoon with a single leather suitcase in her hand. She set it down on the floor. She told her father that she was leaving the estate. She told him that she would not be coming back. She told him she had once watched her mother walk out of this same room for these same reasons, and that she had spent 16 years promising herself she would not become a woman who needed to be saved by leaving. Then she picked up the suitcase and walked out, and Charles Whitmore did not follow her. He sat alone in the green-walled study for a long time, and for the first time since the cardiologist's letter, he felt his heart in a way he could not pretend was abstract. Jacob found the file on a Tuesday. It was on the seat of his van in a plain manila envelope slipped there by someone who had wanted him to find it. He did not know if the someone was a friend or an enemy, and after a while, it did not matter. Inside were the early drafts of a custody petition, a careful surgical document arguing that Sophie Miller's father was financially unstable, socially compromised, and emotionally entangled with a public figure whose presence in the child's life constituted a danger. He read it twice. He sat in the driver's seat with the dome light on, and he read it twice. The second time, he understood what he was reading. As long as Amelia kept coming to his apartment, as long as her face stayed in the same frame as Sophie's, the lawyers on the other side would have a story. As long as he stayed in New York, his daughter would grow up inside that story. He did not drive to the train station that night. The train station had cameras. He drove instead to the apartment above the laundromat, and he packed 2 duffel bags, one for himself, one for Sophie, with the stuffed rabbit she could not sleep without. He took the photograph of Emma off the refrigerator and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took the school bus magnet because Sophie had picked it out herself at a gas station once, and it had cost her $1. At 11 o'clock, he knocked on the door across the hall. Rosa Vargas had lived in that apartment for 31 years. He had repaired her furnace twice, her bathroom radiator 3 times, and her kitchen wiring on the night her husband died, because she had not wanted to be alone in the dark. She opened the door in a blue cotton robe, and she looked at his face, and she did not ask him anything. He gave her his keys. He gave her a small envelope with rent money for the next 2 weeks. He gave her a second envelope sealed with one word written on the front in his careful, blocky handwriting, Amelia. He asked Rosa to leave the second envelope on the bottom step of the side stairs of the Whitmore mansion before the first light. He told her Amelia would find it. He told her Amelia had been walking back to that staircase every dawn since she had left the estate, not to go inside, only to stand on the step where things had started. The staff who came in through the service entrance no longer asked her why. They were used to her by now. Rosa took both envelopes. She touched the side of his face the way an old woman touches her grown son. She told him to be careful. She told him to write when he could. She did not say goodbye. He carried Sophie down the stairs wrapped in her blanket. The night bus pulled away from the corner of Atlantic Avenue at 3 minutes past midnight. Sophie did not wake up. At dawn, Amelia Whitmore stood on the bottom step of the unpolished side staircase of her father's house, in the same yellow light where she had once been handed a folded handkerchief, and she opened the envelope Rosa had left for her. I can bear the world looking down on me. I cannot bear Sophie growing up under a magnifying glass. Live the life you deserve, Amelia. I was lucky beyond measure to have been seen by you even once. She read it twice. The second time her hand began to shake. The yellow bulb above her head buzzed once and went on burning. Amelia did not go home that morning. She walked out of the side stairs of the Whitmore mansion with the letter folded inside her coat, and she did not look back. She rented a 1-bedroom walk-up in a part of the city no one in her father's circle had ever bothered to map, and she paid the deposit out of the same pseudonym account that had once paid for Sophie's hospital room. She unplugged her phone for a week. When she plugged it back in, there were 43 missed calls from her father, and not one from Jacob. She did not answer any of them. Charles Whitmore stood in the doorway of his daughter's old bedroom 3 nights after she left, and he did not turn the light on. The pearls he had given her when she was 16 lay on the dressing table beside the velvet tray. The dresses still hung in the closet. The window was still open, the inch she had always insisted on. The room smelled faintly of her perfume and the cold air off the river. and for a long moment he could not tell whether the woman he had lost from this house was his daughter or his wife. A week later, he collapsed in the green-walled study. His housekeeper found him face down on the rug at 11 in the morning, with the cardiologist's letter he had been rereading that morning, half pulled out of his jacket pocket. The ambulance took him to the same hospital his daughter had once paid for a stranger's child in. From the hospital bed in the small hours of the second night, he called the investigator who had been following Amelia for the better part of 2 months. He told the man to put the file down. He told the man to bring him a different file. He spoke quietly because his throat was still raw from the breathing tube. He said, "I don't want to know what Jacob Miller has done. I want to know who he is." The investigator told him it would take a few days. Charles told him to take as long as he needed. Maria Delgado had worked the counter at a diner in Sunset Park for 19 years. She had a soft voice and a son in community college, and a mother who had been dying slowly for most of 2 years. When her mother's hospice bill had landed on her kitchen table the previous winter, an envelope had appeared 2 days later under her apartment door, with enough cash inside to cover it, and a note that said only, "From a friend." "Please do not ask," she had asked. The super had told her. The super had told her the man across the courtyard with the toolbox had left it. She watched the news for 3 weeks before she did anything. She watched them call him a gold digger. She watched them call him an opportunist. She watched her son shake his head over breakfast and say, "Mama, that's not the man you told me about." On a Tuesday, she sat down at the kitchen table with her phone propped against the salt shaker, and she recorded a video. She did not raise her voice. She told the camera what Jacob Miller had done for her mother. She told the camera she had never gotten to say thank you because he had asked her not to. She told the camera she was saying it now. The video had 2 million views before the end of the week. Then a young doctor at a free clinic in the Bronx posted his own. Jacob had rewired the back room for 3 nights straight, without billing them. A woman in Queens posted hers. Jacob had driven her son to school for a month when her car had been in the shop and had refused gas money. An old veteran in Bay Ridge posted a photograph of the heater Jacob had repaired on a Christmas Eve. 4 winters back, and underneath he wrote, "He sat with me until midnight. He didn't have to. He did." By Friday, the hashtag was on every front page. Who is Jacob Miller? Charles Whitmore watched every video from his hospital bed. He watched them on the tablet his daughter had given him for his birthday 3 years before, and that he had never once turned on. He watched them with the sound low and the curtains drawn. He watched a diner waitress and a doctor and a single mother and a veteran tell him one after another that the man his lawyers were trying to break was the kind of man other people built their kitchens around. The morning he was released, he did not call his car. He took a taxi across the bridge. He stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of a laundromat in Brooklyn in a coat that cost more than the building, and he looked up at a window with a brick wall behind it, and the lights turned off. Rosa Vargas came down the staircase in the same blue cotton robe she had worn on the night Jacob had left. She did not recognize the man on the sidewalk. He told her his name. She told him to come up. She made him coffee in a chipped mug. She did not soften any of it. She told him about the rabbit pancakes. She told him about the night her husband died, and the wiring in her kitchen, and the man who had sat with her until the sun came up. She told him at the end that Jacob had asked her to deliver a letter to a girl on a staircase, and that she had done it because Jacob had earned that much from her and more. Charles set the empty mug down on Rosa's kitchen table and understood, in a way he had not allowed himself to understand in 40 years, that he had spent his entire life buying things no one would ever cry over. He went home that afternoon. He called his lawyers. He called his board. He called the Ashfords. He called a press conference for the following morning. He canceled the merger from a podium in front of 100 reporters. He handed over the documents that proved what Sebastian Ashford had done to a building, to a school, to a child, and he withdrew every lawsuit that bore the Whitmore name against Jacob Miller. Then he looked into the cameras, and with a steadiness that surprised even him, he said, I have spent my whole life building an empire. I never learned how to build a family. I'm trying to learn now. A week later, a woman with a small overnight bag stepped off a bus in a town in Pennsylvania where the main street had 3 traffic lights and a hardware store with a hand-painted sign. She asked at the diner. She asked at the gas station. The third person she asked pointed her toward a machine shop on the edge of town, where a quiet man with a Brooklyn accent had been rewiring the lathes. Amelia Whitmore found Jacob Miller in the back of that shop with grease on his thumb and a coil of copper wire over his shoulder. He looked up. He saw her face. He did not say anything for a long moment. She held out a folded piece of paper. It was wrinkled at the corners. It had been read many times. It was the note she had once slid under his door in Brooklyn, the only thing he had ever taken from her and kept. "I still haven't been allowed to say that apology," she said. In person, Jacob smiled for the first time in many weeks. 1 year later, on a Saturday in late September, a small handful of paper lanterns were strung along the fence of a backyard in a Pennsylvania town no map of New York society had ever bothered to print. The grass was uneven. The fence needed paint. Someone had laid a sheet of plywood on 2 sawhorses for a table and covered it with a blue checkered cloth Sophie had picked out at the hardware store herself. Amelia stood in the middle of the yard with her hair tied back and a glass of lemonade in her hand, and read aloud from a single sheet of paper the mission statement of a small new foundation called Emma's Light. The fund would provide medical care for the children of working families who had been turned away from hospitals they could not afford. It would carry no Whitmore money. It would carry only what Amelia had earned with her own name and the pen name she had once written under, and what other ordinary people had begun to send in small envelopes from kitchens all over the country. Jacob stood by the back door with a wrench still hanging out of his back pocket because he had not had time to take it off. He had been offered the position of ambassador for the foundation. He had said no. He had said he was an electrician. He had said the foundation belonged to Emma and to Amelia and to every other woman who had ever stood at a glass window with shaking hands. Sophie came out of the kitchen with a paper plate. She walked past her father and past Amelia, whom she had begun to call Mia, because Mia was a name that belonged only to the 2 of them, and she stopped in front of a man in a coat that no longer cost more than the building. She held the plate out without saying anything. There was 1 slice of cake on it. Charles Whitmore took it from her with hands he could not quite keep steady, and he sat down on the back step with his granddaughter beside him, and he did not speak for a long time because there were no words he had been taught for the moment. In his coat pocket was a small wooden bird he had whittled himself at the kitchen table in the week since he had come home from the hospital. He had wrapped it in brown paper that morning. The wrapping was uneven at the corners. It was the first thing he had ever wrapped with his own hands. That night, after the lanterns had been blown out, and Sophie had fallen asleep on the porch with one of Mia's hands in her hair, Jacob stood at the railing and looked up at a sky he could finally see stars in. Amelia came out and put her shoulder against his. "There are people born in silk," he said quietly, "who go their whole lives feeling alone. And there are people who have nothing but love. And that somehow is enough to light up another life." She did not answer him. She only nodded once and held on. Inside the house, Sophie laughed at something in her sleep.